You're listening to a CNA podcast.
A few years ago, green hydrogen seemed like it was on a trajectory to become the best new thing in clean, renewable energy. Right now, it's still very minor in scale, it's expensive, and its technology rivals are racing ahead. Today, we do a status check on an energy source that has promised a lot, but left us waiting. Hello, welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board. Lilling Tan is here as always. Hello to you. How's it going?
Hello, Jack. I am fantastic. What about you?
Wow. Yeah, I'm good. I'm fantastic as well. Now, of course, we do like tackling the big topics here on this podcast, but today we're talking about just literally the most abundant thing in the universe. This tiny little element that somehow manages to be everywhere. Yet, somehow we don't quite know how to really use it very well, how to make it this scalable energy solution.
No, we don't, do we? Now, we know the science is there. We know green hydrogen is produced from water using electrolysis only from renewable energy like solar and wind. And that's what makes it green as opposed to gray, brown, or black hydrogen that's extracted from fossil fuels. Now, green hydrogen is already being done, but the question is, how do we make it accessible, available, and affordable? That's the gazillion-dollar question, right?
Speaking of important gazillion-dollar questions, how about a quiz for you to kick things off? Now, of course, you know, and you've just mentioned that hydrogen comes in all colors of the rainbow. Well, you've talked about green hydrogen there, and gray and brown and black, but we also have blue, yellow, gold, pink, turquoise, white, all over the spectrum. Yeah. All these types of hydrogen.
Crazy.
Yeah, so many of them.
Yeah.
Which one, though, would you guess is the most commonly produced form? That's your question for today.
So many colors to choose from. You know what? Let's open this up to our listeners for your options. Gray hydrogen is from natural gas. Blue, also from gas, but the carbon dioxide is captured and stored. Brown and black hydrogen are from different types of coal. Most people know these. Then we get to the interesting colors, right? Gold and white is naturally occurring hydrogen. Pink is from nuclear power. Turquoise from methane without CO2 emissions. And yellow can refer to hydrogen made solely from solar power or a mix of renewables and fossil fuels, depending on who you ask. So there, these are your options.
Wow, talk about a filibuster too. Well, you clearly know your hydrogens though, your different colors. So
I did my research.
I suspect you'll know the answer to this, but for everyone else, have a think, and the answer will be at the end of the episode. Now for our main story this week. It was a few years ago when I was up in far northern Scotland on the Orkney archipelago. I saw firsthand for the first time the applications of hydrogen energy in regular life. Now, Orkney is what they call a living lab. It's a test bed for many of the world's new clean energy technologies. It's rugged like you can barely imagine. The skies are turbulent over this part of the world, and winter comes early. There are these powerful gales sweeping across the island for most of the year, whipping up huge swells in the surrounding Atlantic Ocean, which pound the shorelines of these islands. Now, hydrogen there was a big part of the picture in Orkney. So I rode in local council vehicles that stopped at hydrogen stations to refuel. A program was underway to power the ferries that were braving the big waves with hydrogen. As well, there were plans to convert electricity into hydrogen, which could then be used to provide auxiliary power to the ships in dock, or to be stored for other uses. There were these bright spots all over for green hydrogen, a way of integrating power that would otherwise be wasted and decarbonising fossil fuel heavy industries like shipping and aviation. This was kind of like this hydrogen utopia that maybe we expected would start to appear elsewhere. But that was 2021, and since, the development and investment in green hydrogen has really slowed down.
Thank you for that, Jack, for taking us on that journey to the Orkney archipelago.
Highly recommend a visit.
Yeah, I'd love to go there at some point, Orkney. But anyway, you are right. There are several reasons why the development and investment in green hydrogen has slowed. First, though, let me put my explainer cap back on and expand on how green hydrogen works, why it's useful, and what are the biggest challenges. And if we don't do it well, we've got a guest coming in who can fact check us. Now, as I touched on earlier, green hydrogen is produced by using electrolysis to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And if you do that process using wind or solar or tidal energy, it's clean. But the process of using renewable energy is very challenging. It's really expensive to start with, and the electrolysis required to scale up hydrogen production is just monumental. And storing and transporting hydrogen is also problematic, and there are infrastructure issues globally as well. And of course, there's still a lack of international standards, so that's hindering investment and research.
Okay, well, good to see you delivering all the bad news, as usual.
You're welcome.
For the hydrogen industry. Yeah, a lot of this seems so frustrating as well, right? Given that hydrogen is the most abundant element on the planet. All of what you've said there shows the clear obstacles that green hydrogen is facing. We really expected to see more of it, I think, for it to show up in passenger vehicles, for example. We know that the Korean and Japanese car companies bet big on hydrogen cells instead of electric batteries, as well as in ships and planes, and all of that's looking like a losing bet right now. The battery is beating down on the hydrogen cell. Of course, there are other applications where hydrogen is still useful. We should note that the Asia-Pacific region is the leader in this technology, produces nearly half of the world's global output. China is the biggest player right now.
Great. Let's bring in someone who really knows this industry inside out. In the hot seat today is Alex Tancock, the CEO of InterContinental Energy. Alex, thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here with you all.
Okay, to start off, let's find out a little bit more about the company. InterContinental Energy was set up in 2014 with a vision to pioneer the production of green hydrogen at scale. Am I right?
Yeah, we set this company up almost 10 years ago with the vision of doing really large-scale renewable energy. Now, obviously, wind farms and solar farms are now well-known technologies. You see those projects all over the place. But more than half of the energy we consume is done in the form of molecules, not electrons. So if we are going to have a more sustainable supply chain of energy, it's not just enough to make electrons using wind and solar. We have to start making molecules using wind and solar. In order to do that, you really need scale, right? If we're going to compete, as it were, with oil and gas molecules, then green molecules need to be done at the same scale.
Okay.
So what we decided to do was to try and develop a series of incredibly large projects that could achieve that scale.
Can you give us a little bit of a status update from your perspective on actually how green hydrogen production is going? Admittedly, it is energy intensive, it is costly. Is it worth persisting with when there are other alternatives at the same time, batteries and electricity storage, for example, going well, it seems?
So it's not really a question of competition between wind and solar to make electrons for the grid with batteries for storage and green molecules. They don't compete at all. There are industries that have no substitution for molecules, whether it's at the very basic end making fertilizer, many of the processes in industrial processes in refineries. There is no substitute for molecules and for hydrogen. So you can't just decide to use batteries. For example, aviation, shipping, steel production. These are sectors where you just need a molecule. You know, if you're running a container ship from Europe to Singapore, you need fuel. You can't put in batteries. You would have no space left for any of your goods. So we do need a substitute for those fossil fuel derived molecules. So to make green molecules, you need essentially three major inputs. You need wind, sun, and seawater. So the cheaper that wind and solar energy become, and the cheaper that batteries become, the cheaper the green molecules become. It's not an either or. That renewable energy is an input into the process that we use. The difference is, though, that if you're building projects that compete for those electrons next to a city, let's say, right? At the moment, you look at the explosive growth of electricity demand through data centers, through cars that are now charging off the network, and through just general economic growth. You know, imagine a place like Singapore. There's just no space to put a massive amount of renewable energy project in to then make green molecules. So you need to go to parts of the world where there are no people and lots of resources, which are typically, let's call them deserts or areas a bit like that. So you can find these very large projects. So for example, our largest project in Australia has a land area about 30 times the size of Singapore.
Incredible.
And we can use that land area, which is very, very sunny and very, very windy. You know, you're talking wind speeds that are similar to offshore Europe and solar resources that are Australian desert. And then you combine that energy with seawater to make green molecules. Now, coming back to the point you made about, you know, the sort of the challenges that we're currently facing, I would put it in historical context as well. So if you look at the 4 most recent energy technologies that we've developed that have been quite successful at growing globally: LNG, nuclear energy, wind, and solar. Now, all of these 4 technologies have grown at very similar rates, which is quite interesting. But if you normalize their growth rates, they've all grown at almost the same speed, which is 0.07% of global energy per year. Now, if you normalize that to where we are in hydrogen, that would mean that if we grew at the same speed between now and 2050, we'd be 2% of global energy. So I think part of the issue that's faced the hydrogen industry is not the lack of progress, of which there's much. It's the hype and the expectations were just too high. I think everybody saw hydrogen as this silver bullet, and we would click our fingers and like we'd all be driving hydrogen cars and flying around in hydrogen-powered airplanes. But if you look at these last 4 technologies, they've grown at 0.07% of global energy per year, which it's a lot, but it's also not a lot.
So you're saying it's kind of a course correction on the expectations on green hydrogen at scale, right?
I think that's a very good way to put it, yes.
Okay.
I think we went through this hype cycle. We're now, I think, a lot more cognizant of what the industry can achieve in the near term. And yet we're also, I think, more aware of just how much potential there now is in the long term. If you look at like the shipping industry, the aviation industry, the steel industry, I think we've gone from will green hydrogen play a role to just understanding how quickly can it play a role.
Okay, so to what extent has cheaper prices for wind and solar reduced the pool of applications for green hydrogen?
I think what we've discovered, or what we are discovering as a sort of a global industry, is exactly where green molecules make more sense versus using, as you just said, cheaper renewables with some batteries. So, you know, things like refineries, making chemicals like methanol, shipping, aviation, steel, and very long-term storage of energy, where you need to store energy for days and weeks, not hours like in a battery. I think in those areas, it's pretty clear now that green molecules will have to play a role, because it's just inconceivable that batteries will play a role anytime soon. I'm talking the next few decades.
Okay.
In all the other categories where some people have touted hydrogen, we may well find that you're right and that electrons and batteries take care of that. So cars, I think we can all sort of start seeing that, you know, battery cars are probably going to dominate that sector. So things like that.
Okay.
But that's still a huge category. Now, I'll give you an example that's absolutely terrifying when you think about it. So one of our projects is in the northwest of Australia, in the Pilbara. The Pilbara is the world's largest iron ore exporting region. The Pilbara exports in the order of 800 million tons a year of iron ore. If we took our Australian Renewable Energy Hub project in the Pilbara, this is a 26 gigawatt project. So this is bigger than the Three Gorges Dam in China. If we used all of that energy to make green iron, we would offset 4% of the Pilbara's energy consumption to make iron. So think about that. A project bigger than the Three Gorges Dam, and it would just do 4% of the Pilbara's iron exports. And that just shows you how much carbon we are consuming in making our products. So at the moment what happens is that iron ore gets exported and it's basically reduced using coal. It's an extraordinary amount of emissions and the fossil fuel energy consumption. So, you know, the challenge is there for us to decarbonize that entire supply chain. And the opportunity is absolutely huge in this one industry, which is just steel exports from this one part of Australia. So I wouldn't put it in the context of it's one or the other. It's not about saying wind and solar to make electrons is good and wind and solar to make molecules is competitive. The fact is we need all of it, right? And now we've got even new uses, right? Data centers, are starting to consume tremendous amounts of energy. Electric cars are going to consume tremendous amounts of electricity. So we need to tap into these resources around the world where we have them. And you can look at these massive deserts, which have huge amounts of potential that are currently unused for clean energy. So that's really what companies like InterContinental Energy are trying to do, trying to use those resources again to make molecules for sectors that can't really decarbonize any other way.
How cheap do you think green hydrogen has to become in order to be actually very useful and viable for these industries that you're talking about? How long can the industry kind of persist with what is a painful learning period, ramping up period, before you reach this tipping point where it really is useful for the world?
That is the key question. If I look at some of the historical analogies, wind and solar in the 1980s grew quite slowly in terms of the overall scale of it. It was really only in the late 90s when I entered the renewable sector that projects started accelerating at larger scale. Those industries took 1 or 2 decades to ramp up and get going. But when I was a kid, you would have these little solar panels on your calculators. And that was probably the closest you got to a solar panel. So this technology actually spent an awful long time ramping up to get to where it became ubiquitous. Now, with green hydrogen, will it be 1 decade, 2 decades? We've already been going for 1 decade. If I had to guess, I would say when you look at the 2030s, there is a reason to be quite confident that these projects are going to start achieving the scale and price points that are necessary. We're looking at a new generation of equipment coming through. So a lot of the benefit of the hype cycle that we've seen was that there was a lot of funding went into technology companies, whether they're making electrolyzers, compressors, balance of plant, all the associated equipment that we need. So that technology wave is coming through in the coming years to commercialization and production. So we're going to see a massive ramp up in efficiency and a ramp down in cost. The other benefit we have is the Chinese market is coming to the table big time. And China absolutely drove the solar industry to what it is today. China is to some degrees taking over in the wind sector. It already leads the battery sector. But what we're seeing is that in the green hydrogen space, the Chinese ecosystem is coming to bear. And that's going to drive down costs, improve efficiency, and it's going to improve equipment. So I think there's a lot of trends converging that would suggest that from sort of 2030 onwards, we are going to start seeing quite a big ramp up in project delivery. The other thing I would say is that the buyers are coming to the table more. If I think back to some of the conversations we were having with buyers and investors, let's say 4 years ago at the very beginning of the hype cycle, the conversation was, what is green hydrogen? That was the level of conversation. Like, is this a thing? Do I need to know about it? What do I need to know about it? Now what we're seeing is they actually have plans in place. So they know they're going to be buying it from this year, from this year, from this year, from this year. So we've seen a lot of progress on the offtake and the government policy support. That should all start coming through in the years ahead.
I did want to talk about your company's concept, the node concept. What does this involve exactly, and how does it overcome the challenges that Jack and you were talking about earlier, especially when it comes to logistics and just bringing things together?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. We're very excited about the P2H2 node. And essentially what it is if you look at how you develop really, really, really big projects, the best way to make them successful is to break them down into really small bite-sized chunks and to have those chunks be repeatable. So instead of building one massively complex project that is 30 times the size of Singapore, you break it down into 35 small projects which can be repeated. And to the degree possible, that equipment can be built in a factory, shipped to site, and quickly installed. So you take what is very complex project risk and you turn it into mass production manufacturing with on-site modularity. So that's exactly how the solar industry and the wind industry have been so successful. You make the panels in a factory, you ship them out to site, quickly install them. So what our team realized a few years ago is that if you do this breaking down of big projects into what we now call the node, then you can greatly reduce the cost of your production. from everything we've worked on now, the cost of producing green hydrogen from a node is 10 to 20% cheaper than conventional ways of thinking about things. If you imagine like Lego blocks, if you break your project into little Lego blocks and you just have to assemble the blocks, it's a much simpler way of delivering a project. And with each of our nodes, what we're doing is we are removing the very expensive electrical equipment, and we're putting the turbines and the solar panels as close as possible to the production of the hydrogen in the electrolyzer. So if you imagine if you take a big table and you split it into 35 sections, and in the middle of each section you have a node, and around it you have the wind and the sun, and then each of these nodes is connected by hydrogen pipelines, and those hydrogen pipelines act as batteries. So instead of having to spend money on extra batteries, we have the batteries built into the pipeline network. And that's exactly how your current gas networks work anywhere in the world, right? The pipelines in the network act as the battery for the network.
Alex, obviously you have a lot of your projects in Australia where you have a government that appears to be quite committed to supporting green hydrogen. An election coming up there soon, which may impact the energy outlook for the country. At the same time, we have a lot of turbulence in global markets, in global supply chains because of Trump's new tariffs, and an administration in Washington that seems a little bit agnostic towards funding clean tech. So how do you view all this, and how do you kind of navigate what is quite a turbulent period?
I've been in the sector 25 years in the renewable sector, and we've seen previous turbulence before. The great financial crisis of the late 2000s, the European economic crisis of the sort of 2013, 2014. And at the end of the day, the fundamentals matter. If you can produce a commercially attractive energy source that's emissions free as a bonus, people want that. Economies want that. The societies want that. So these kind of short-term perturbations, we've seen them before, and yet the industry keeps going from strength to strength. Sure, you might have the slowdown for a year or two, but broadly speaking, the trend line has gone one way. So from that perspective, we look at our projects from a very long-term outlook. This is not a sprint, this is a marathon. We'll navigate the best we can, but at this point in time, it doesn't change anything from our point of view.
Now, if you could change one policy tomorrow to accelerate green hydrogen development, what would it be?
If it was that simple, it would be great. I think, again, if you look at historical parallels, they can be useful and instructive. If you look at the renewable energy industry that developed in the wind and solar space, they had the good fortune of being very local and domestic plays to begin with. So, for example, if you are the German government and you want more renewables, you can basically legislate that the cost of electricity goes up a bit to pay for initially more expensive renewables. And so you've got German consumers paying for German manufactured equipment. Now, okay, the cost of electricity goes up a little bit in the short term, but there are lots of benefits to be had long term, so you're willing to do it. The more difficult aspect of molecules is that they are globally traded on the whole. Whether they're traded as a molecule itself in the form of some chemical, methanol, whatever it's going to be, ammonia, or whether they're traded in the form of the product that's ultimately made, like steel, or they're consumed globally, like in shipping or aviation, between different countries. So unlike in the electricity space where governments could take control of their own destiny, the molecule space requires far more coordination globally, and it requires far more coordination between buyers and sellers. And I think what we've seen is it's just proving to be slightly more complex than everybody thought it would be. There are some positive points to look at where progress is going to be made, it looks like. So for example, in shipping is regulated by the IMO, which is an international organization that represents 98% of all shippers, something of that order of magnitude. These measures are happening in the background. It's just taken a long time. That's why it's hard to say there is one policy. It is that sort of combination of having to have cheaper product because of innovation and scale, and then you've got to have policies that are going to be put in place. It's probably going to be a patchwork across the world. Whereas is it 5 years, 10 years? We will get there. And by 2050, there will be a growing volume of green molecules that help us decarbonize those hard to abate sectors.
I like your optimism, and I hope for the sake of the planet, some of these clean options really get into our energy systems sooner rather than later. Great to chat, Alex. We'll be watching the trends in the hydrogen sector very closely, I'd say, over the next few years.
Thank you, Alex.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Back to our quiz question, repeating it for you. I think this is an easy one. Which colour hydrogen is the most commonly produced form?
I'm going to go with...
Do you need to remember all the colours?
No, this one's easy. I'm just going to go with grey hydrogen. I think that's pretty uncontested.
It is correct. Grey hydrogen, overwhelmingly the most produced form, of course, powered by fossil fuels. The numbers vary, but it's a fair chunk of the total hydrogen produced, up to 75%.
This was practically a giveaway quiz, Jack. You know you wanted this quiz just so we could go through the colours of the rainbow, right?
Sure.
All right, then.
All right, that's all for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks for joining us.
And catch you again next week. I'm Lilling Tan. Bye for now.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks as always to the team who put together this podcast, Saya Win, Tiffany Ang, Janani Johari, and Crispina Roberts.